the other end of that.
Yeah, she's watching. So I was thinking, I may not even have to do this tonight, but Harrison and watch it later. So.
My baby's coming home tonight.
Oh, yeah.
Landed in Miami.
And he gets just about 2 weeks, a little less, Victor said.
He goes back on the 5th.
Oh, well, that's good. Yeah.
I'm excited to see his.
Yeah.
So I had a very, very nice visit.
And you're all set up in your new venture. I see. I saw you got your email the other day with your. Yeah. So that is fantastic.
We'll see.
Oh, it'll be good.
I don't have to, but I thought I might as well.
Yeah, you might as well.
Since June, and I didn't do anything about it. Yeah. And I thought, well, why not? I don't have the storage anymore, so.
Well, everybody, I know some realtors, and they all love their job because they're people. They're people. And that's what you like, people.
Yeah.
So, be good at that. All right, well. Tessa! The whole internet world hears me calling your name. I don't want to start without her, but we are going to be tonight actually in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. We're going to skip over to 2 Kings for just a little bit because I went through part of that a couple of weeks ago, and I want to go back and look at particularly Hezekiah's prayer that he offers. But we're going to finish up Chronicles, and then we'll skip back over and look at that other. Hey there, Bert. Can you shut that door for me? Because it gets loud. They're loud, and women are loud. All right. So last week we talked about Hezekiah. Hezekiah being a good king, but he wound up being a foolish king. He, toward the end, he shows off to the Babylonians. We're going to look at some of that tonight. We looked at a piece of it last time. What was actually happening geopolitically was Assyria was the overwhelming force in the region, and they had actually taken Philistia and Babylon and the northern kingdom and had threatened the southern kingdom. But if you recall, Hezekiah was able, with the help of God, to hold that off. So he prayed to God. God arranged for the king of Assyria to go back home because there was an uprising by who? The Babylonians. And while he was there, his own sons killed him. Now this is about a 20-year period, they think, that all of this went on for. During that 20-year period, Hezekiah was able to build a lot of wealth and a lot of security for the southern kingdom. So things were looking good for Hezekiah. During that same time, even though Assyria was still the major player in the region, there was an uprising being formed by Babylon. They wanted to overthrow Assyria, and they were quietly going around and getting support from these other nations, including Judah. And what finally happens is Assyria is overthrown, and Babylon does take control and winds up carrying Judah into exile. So that's the big 30,000 foot view geopolitically. And part of the reason why God, or really the main reason why God allowed for all this to happen, was he became displeased with Hezekiah because he had he was lending himself to be dependent upon the Babylonians for his security. And we see all the way through the story that when God's people begin to trust in anyone or anything else, then everything begins to fall apart. If you wanted the big meta narrative that's going on here is having a full faith and trust in God, not compromising, not to the right, to the left. Everything's just straight down the middle with God. And every time that a king or a leader or the country would either worship other gods or depend upon another country, God had to deal with that in some sort of way. Well, there's a collective bank account that's kind of being emptied with God's people, and finally he has enough and says, I'm going to have to deal with this in the way that I told your servant Moses that I was going to do this. And Moses knew that they were going to be carried off into exile right before he let them cross, and he stayed in the wilderness. So this is all a part of God's plan from the very beginning. It's just tragic the way that it has to come about. And so as that relates to our life, we some of us can see those parallels quite obvious in the way in some decisions we make, and that really wasn't, God wasn't in that. And we begin to see that it was never going to work. In fact, maybe the pain and suffering that those decisions caused could have been avoided if I'd just stayed with God. And that's the big lesson from all of this. The details, though, the details provide us with a roadmap of how we are able to maneuver through these pitfalls that we find ourselves in and still come out okay. Or at least maybe not without any... We'll be okay, but we may be experiencing discipline in the process, okay? Which is ultimately what the people come to discover, is that while they're being disciplined by God, there's actually a lot of growth going on in the relationship with God. So if that's been your experience, just say amen, because it's been my experience. So that's kind of the overview. Chapter 32 of 2 Chronicles, we verses 1 through 5 we covered in the 2 Kings passage, where it's talking about they're planning for war. So they go out and they stop up the wells that are visible to the Assyrians. There's a spring that they're able to tap. And it was ingenious what they did. There was a stream that was up in the hills in the Kidron Valley, and they built a tunnel from that spring all the way underneath the wall and into Jerusalem, so that they had water. And they actually started one group of guys started at one end, and one group started at the other, and somehow they met in the middle. And I think that's amazing. The reason why I say that, if you've ever been to Colorado, there's a tunnel called the Loveland Tunnel, and it was built. Interstate 70 passes through it, so it was built for Interstate 70. And as they were building it, they realized as they got close that they were off by more than a foot. Okay, so what do? So they both had to make corrections in order for this tunnel to meet right, so they could put a 4-lane highway with a divider in it. Okay, so these guys built it, and the reason why they know that, or the way that they know that it was started at both ends and completed in the middle, is in the tunnel. There's to this day an inscription of what they did. So so it's pretty cool. So anyway, that's the big engineering feat that Hezekiah was able to accomplish to save his people. And without it, they wouldn't have been able to survive at all. They would have been without water. Syrian king or anybody could have cut them off from their water supply. It's the strange thing about Jerusalem, is that there was no natural water supply where God chose for his city to be. Now, if you were here on Sunday nights, which Tessa is, then you would have a kind of an idea about what might be going on there. Because water, from the very beginning of Genesis, becomes a symbol of life that pops up everywhere in the Old Testament. Okay? But in Jerusalem, of all places, we don't have the water. So what would you imagine God is saying through that? Who is the river of life in Jerusalem but him? See? So you can get water anywhere, but there's no water that represents life in Jerusalem other than what is found in the temple. So another one. We keep finding them as we go through on Sunday night. We just keep finding little nuggets of water lore all the way through. Because what we do find that in the picture of the temple, and even Ezekiel refers to it in his prophecy about water flowing from the temple and out the threshold and making a hard left turn going up a hill and to the east, referring exactly to his own people that were going to leave Jerusalem, be sent into exile. But for God, it was a river of life going into Babylon to bring his presence into that nation. Because since the very beginning, he said, "You're going to be my nation of priests." So that's what that is. Anyway, so a great aside there. So verse 6 says, "So he set military commanders over the people, and he gathered the people in the square of the city gate." We don't have any of this in 2 Kings. That's why we're going over it. "Then he encouraged them, saying, 'Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged before the king of Assyria or before the large army that is with him. For there are more with us than with him.'" Okay, so this is, be strong and courageous is first said by who? Anybody know? Joshua. So they cross into the promised land, and they're at the camp there. And Joshua has been given, God comes and speaks to Joshua, and he says, "You're my guy. Here's my word that I gave you through my man Moses. You study this, you ponder it, you live by it every day." And then God says to him, "Be strong, be courageous." And then Joshua turns around and says those very same things to the people. Twice in the Kings, we've seen them repeat that same call to the people: be strong, be courageous. So in that, the writer of Chronicles is tying everything about this period in Israel's history all the way back to Joshua. This is the real opportunity that exists here. We can do this again the way that Joshua did it. So Hezekiah was that way. We've looked at a couple of kings that take that attitude where it is possible to regain again the city of David, so to speak, the kingship of David. And so in this language we see that again. It says, "Don't be afraid and don't be discouraged before the king of Syria, before the large army that was with him, for there are more with us than them." So y'all remember, I forget which king it is, where they heard horses in the clouds. Yeah, this was during Elijah and Elisha's time. And God literally mowed down this opposing army with his angels. And the very same thing was said, we have an army that they can't see. And so the writer, Hezekiah, is drawing in on the same kind of... So the whole thing reflects this. God is fighting this battle for us, which he says, and which Asa said. So this little lecture, this little demonstration that Hezekiah is providing ties a lot of things together from the past. He has only human strength, but we have the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. So the people replied to the words of King Hezekiah. They relied on the words of King Hezekiah of Judah. So that last sentence we can't just run by, because Hezekiah is speaking like a priest to his people. He's declaring what God is going to do for them, and they trust in those words as they would as if they were from God himself. So that's what a priest did. So we've talked about this before. As a person that is going to intercede on our behalf with God, you either do it as a prophet or a priest or a king, and there's occasions where any number of those three can be combined in one person. So here we have it with he's the king, and he's really behaving like a priest, reassuring his people and bringing his people. So from verse 9 down to verse 19, actually, we've already looked at in the 2 Kings passage. The account beginning in verse 20 is different, so we're going to look at it a little bit. So after all this has been said by Sennacherib, then it says in verse 20, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, prayed about this and cried out to heaven. We're going to go back and look at the prayer here in a minute. And the Lord sent his angel, who annihilated every valiant warrior, leader, and commander in the camp of the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria returned in disgrace to his land. He went to the temple of his God, and there some of his own children struck him down with the sword. So we look at that and we say, oh man, this keeps happening everywhere. Kids keep killing their parents for the crown. But what the writer's pointing out is that what happened to the Assyrian king was utterly disgraceful. Okay? So there's several things in the ancient culture that are you just can't abide. Receiving shame from anyone, and it's sticking to you, and then performing in a way that would bring disgrace upon your country, your people, your family. Okay, so that's really the motivating factor for his sons killing him, is he had disgraced his own family by what had happened to him, both in the Babylonian battlefield and also the way that he just abandoned Jerusalem, which really he probably could have dealt with both at the same time, militarily and civilly. But who's pulling the strings in the background? God is. God already said, I'm sending him back. Okay. So for whatever reason, probably poor judgment, he goes back and deals with this other situation that ultimately leads to his death. And from the chronicler, this is no accident. This is God taking care of his people. And so it's one of those things where sometimes things happen and they happen good for us and we don't really know why. We didn't do anything to deserve it and didn't see it coming. Really didn't make any sense. And then you look back and think, maybe God's doing some things there. All right. So, he went on. So in 22, so the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the power of the king of Syria and from the power of all others. Here's this line again. He gave them rest on every side. Okay? This is the ultimate sign that God was present and that he had achieved what he wanted for his people. They were either at rest or at peace on every side. There was no threat at all. And when there was no threat, you could become prosperous. Okay? And because God was providing it, you naturally understood that it really belonged to God. And so that is the whole foundation for the idea of tithing, is you rely on God, he brings peace, you prosper, and in return God says bring a tenth. And then what does God want the tenth for? To take care of the priests so they can continue bringing about the relationship between God and his people, because that's the way he had it set up at the time, see? And so it all works together. It's not just a legalistic thing where we're going to, it says do it, so we do it. It has a function of relationship. And it comes as a result of God's provision. Many were bringing an offering to the Lord, reflecting this that I was just speaking of, and valuable gifts to King Hezekiah of Judah, and he was exalted in the eyes of all the nations after that. So God does this thing. He deals with the king of Assyria, but Hezekiah gets the praise. So that one little line there kind of is the hinge upon which everything begins to swing the wrong direction. God does everything, but it says, and he was exalted in the eyes of the nation after that. So what we see in the next passages is a result of that, of not giving the proper thing that should have followed this. They should have said, but Hezekiah gave honor to the Lord for all that he had done. But we don't read that passage. It's not there because he doesn't do that. He behaves in a very prideful way, and God has to deal with him, and ultimately becomes part of one of the pieces of the puzzle that arranges for the exile. So in 24, in those days Hezekiah became sick to the point of death. So he prayed to the Lord, and he spoke to him, and he gave him a miraculous sign. We don't know what this sign is. Okay. All we know is that later it's mentioned again. The Babylonians come to visit him because they want to hear about the sign. they're amazed. So the miraculous sign may very well be that whatever had him near death, he's over. Maybe the story around town is that they were ready to put this fellow in the fire, to be burned, and he miraculously got well. We don't know what it is. But anyway, he spoke to him, and God gave him a miraculous sign. And as close as we know, it just has something to do with his healing. However, this goes back to verse 23. Because his heart was proud, Hezekiah didn't respond according to the benefit that had come to him. What is that saying? Very kindly, it is saying he didn't thank God for what God had done for him. So he's claiming the sign as something special that he should have gotten. So there was wrath on him, Judah, and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Lord's wrath didn't come on them during Hezekiah's lifetime. So here's this great, very succinct almost one verse, 2 verse teaching here. You get proud, God's going to deal with your pride. The minute you're humble, what's God do? He removes his wrath. He has no interest in harming anyone. He has no interest in punishing anyone. What God has interest in is humility, obviously. And so when we allow for our lives to find that place of humility and maintain that place of humility, then God's hand naturally remains. Okay, because that's where he wants to be. That's the life that he can be with. But a life that's full of pride becomes puffed up with our own sinfulness. And God has no choice because he's holy. And now we've set ourselves up to, like the Tower of Babel, we're going to be something like him. We're deserving of some little something. And so God has to deal with that. I don't know why, but I've been reading a lot about churches, 21st century churches that have gone, and man, it's amazing how every one of them, it's from pride within the church, within the leader, maybe not the leader, but the church, or vice versa. It's just amazing. But every one of them, when they begin to see themselves or behave in such a way where you can kind of sniff out the pride, something bad happens every time. And so God hasn't changed the way that he views that kind of reality in a person's life, and he hasn't changed the way that he views humility either. Every church has the opportunity, or every person, or every situation that finds itself private before God has the opportunity to change that. Just like Hezekiah did, him and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So there's Jerusalem, and then there's the people. We've come across this numerous times. The people of the land, it may say at some point, or they'll refer to them without referring to the people of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was kind of the royal class. So there was definitely a class system. And the people that lived away from everyday worship were kind of thought of as country bumpkins. And then there were those people. And so what he's saying here is all of Jerusalem had kind of taken on the personality of the king. And they all needed to repent of it. And they did. And so God withheld his wrath during Hezekiah's lifetime, but he doesn't withhold it after Hezekiah's lifetime. I mean, he's saving it up. So you've heard the thing where, the sins of the father are visited on the children and to the third and fourth generation. Well, some of that is found here. Okay, it's definitely an Old Testament idea. God doesn't deal with sin in quite that same way, but here it is saying that there's repentance and there's humility that's brought about by Hezekiah, but there's no way that fixes everything that follows, because every generation is responsible for its own relationship with God. But God has every reason to carry that forward to the day that he finally and ultimately deals with his wrath. Now, we're thankful for that because he does that with Christ. There's two things that happen at the cross. One is God's wrath is satisfied finally on sin that exists, and we are cleansed of our sin. Okay? They both work together. Some theologies pit the two against each other so that they can't really work together. But what God is doing in order to deal with his wrath against sin is to cleanse us. And of course, the person that took all of that on himself is Jesus. He had to deal with all of it. And he was the only one that could. Okay. So Hezekiah's wealth. Hezekiah had an abundance of riches and glory, and he made himself. The middle tense here is important for us to understand that Hezekiah is kind of self-serving in these things. He made himself treasuries of silver, gold, precious stones, spices, shield, and every desirable item. He's become a collector of fine things that are quite valuable. He made warehouses for the harvest of grain, new wine and fresh oil, and stalls for all kinds of cattle and pens for flocks. He made cities for who? Himself. And he acquired vast numbers of flocks and herds, for God gave him abundant possessions. So that's what's going on here. God's provided peace, and God is providing the abundance. But the writer is sure to help us understand that Hezekiah sees this as belonging to him, and he's making preparations for himself. It would have been too easy to say for the people or for the nation or in response to God's bounty or whatever it would have been, but they're careful to point out that he's doing this for himself. This same Hezekiah blocked the outlet of water in the upper Gihon and channeled it smoothly downward and westward to the city of David. That's the tunnel I was telling you about. He succeeded in everything he did. Now, when the ambassador of Babylon's rulers were sent to him to inquire about the miraculous sign, see, they're curious as to what this sign was and how he was able to be healed. And it says that it happened in the land. We just don't know what it is. God left him to test him and discover what was in his heart. All right, so what we find out in the King's passage, and also this is recorded in Isaiah chapters 38 and 39, I think, is that they show up and he goes and shows them everything. You remember the King's passage, we were talking about this before. And he shows them all his wealth and everything that he has. And Isaiah comes and asks him, he says, what you been doing? He says, I've been showing my new friends all my cool stuff. And he says, you are foolish. He says, they're going to go back and they're going to figure out a way to come get all this. You've brought defeat upon your own people. And of course he's all sad about it, but it's too late because the cat's out of the bag. Everybody knows what he's got now. And it's true. They probably were there to make a military alliance, but really in proportion, Judah's like maybe 20% of the size of what Babylon would bring to an army, to a fight. So it makes perfect sense for Babylon to say, hey, if we take Judah, we've got wealth to even build our empire more. And it'll be an easy take because there's not that many of them compared to us. It's dumb. Just dumb. But that's what the illustration is. That's what pride gets you, see. And, hey, Justin. So when the pride begins to take place, see, he began to think, all this is mine. I can show it off as mine. When the proper response would have been, this is what God has provided for us. And I really don't need to show it to anybody because I have no control over it. It's not mine. It was given to us. I'm storing it up for the people, whatever. But he doesn't do any of that. So it creates some real problems for him. Then it says, as for the rest of the events of Hezekiah's reign and his deeds of faithful love, note that they are written in the visions of the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. That's our Isaiah. And in the book of the kings of Judah, which we've also been studying. First time that they've mentioned books that we're actually able to look at. Hezekiah rested with his fathers and was buried on the ascent of the tombs of David's descendants. All Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem paid him honor at his death. His son Manasseh became king in his place. All right, so there's an interesting line here. In 32 it says, as for the rest of the events of Hezekiah's reign and his deeds of faithful love. Okay, so that word faithful love the Hebrew word is hesed, and it's used a great deal to describe God's love for his people. Okay, also our love for him, but not to the intensive degree that it's used for God's love for us. So faithful love, that word hesed, when we translate it into the Greek and into the English, it comes into the Greek as agape, which we all know to be God's kind of love. And that's the love we're to have for one another. So we don't read anything in this account anywhere of this great outpouring of Hezekiah's faithful love other than at the beginning when he was destroying all the objects of idol worship, and he reintroduced to the people God's love for them. And so I really understand this to be that this is really the summary statement of saying this was the motivation of everything that Hezekiah had done, was he wanted to exhibit hesed, a faithful love to God and to his people. And he did a good job of that. His failures in that were not going to be a part of his life. God said, I'm going to wait because you've humbled yourself before me. You know, my wrath will have, there'll be plenty to go around after Manasseh and his son gets through with things. Okay. Now there's something about that spiritually, theologically, I guess, that I find interesting, and that is that we can only do what we can do in our lifetime. And our lifetime is vapor compared to all of human history, even generationally within our own families. If you look, you know, to your predecessors and to those that will be your descendants, the little slice of your life in the midst of all of that's tiny. But God has such a love for that little bit of slice that He's willing to be all of Himself to us in that little bitty moment of time. And so we have a real opportunity to do what we can do with that, with Him. Now, and these people, they had no idea of an eternal nature with God. David had some hint of that in his Psalms. He says, "Oh Lord, don't let me go to the place of the dead." Well, what choice did you have? Because that's all there was. David began to have this idea that I can be with you. You're such a friend to me. Your depth of love is so evident to me that there's another option at death. I can go be with you. And then the prophets pick up on this same idea about an eternalness with God. And by the time Jesus gets on the scene, this has become really the standard practice and belief of the Pharisees of all people. The Sadducees not, but the Pharisees. And so they had an idea where, yeah, we can go be with God. That's why they were so sticklers about the law, because that was the only way to get there. Otherwise, you were going to the place of the dead. And by that time, it had gotten so mixed up with the way the Greeks and Romans saw the place of the dead, and you really didn't want to go there. And so the concept of an eternal life with God took centuries to finally develop, so that when Jesus comes and begins to speak about it, there's this idea, yeah, we've heard about that. Is it really that I just trust you? Do you have it? See, that was the big change. That there's no way to work yourself into it. There's no way to become anything that's going to be great enough to enter. It comes to this place of trust in me. Your faith is going to make you whole, well, healed. All those different words that Jesus is illustrating. It's faith that does these things, not anything else. And faithful love carries that word hesed carries that same type of thing. You accept God is steadfast in His love for you, and you accept that. And that's why the peace on every side could come. You lived in it and you accepted it. The prayer, we kind of ran through it last time because we were in a hurry. But this prayer that Hezekiah prays in 2 Kings chapter 20. Let's see. It's a simple little prayer. It's 2 verses long. Chapter 20, verse 2. It says, "Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. Please, Lord, remember how I have walked before you faithfully and wholeheartedly and have done what pleases you." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Okay? So he becomes terminally ill. This is kind of the parallel to the miraculous sign, okay, that we're talking about in the other passage. So Hezekiah desperately does not want to die. Okay? He wants to live. So he says, remember, this is the reason why he wants to live. Remember how I have walked before you faithfully and wholeheartedly. So the way that I've lived my life, I want it to matter to you in some sort of way. Let my faithfulness and my the wholeheartedness is that same concept of faithful love. Remember how I have walked before you and faithfully and wholeheartedly have done what pleases you. So, quite simply, the whole system of worship for God is described over and over again as sacrifice that was pleasing. Okay? So what would that do? What did that mean? You did the sacrifice properly and it pleased God, so because he could be with his people then. There was a cleansing that occurs, and so he could be with us. And so it's the same kind of thing. My life has been something like a living sacrifice. I have walked before you faithfully and wholeheartedly, and it has pleased you. There's rest on every side. Your presence is obvious among us. And so Hezekiah wept bitterly because obviously something had come up in his life that he believed had put all of that in the reverse. That none of that mattered to God anymore, because here he was dying before his time. And he must have done something to offend God. Okay? And he weeps about it. He's crying about it. He's suffering because of it. Then it goes on to say, Isaiah had not yet gone out of the inner courtyard when the word of the Lord came to him and said, go back and tell Hezekiah, the leader of my people, this is what the Lord God, your ancestor David said, your ancestor David says, I have heard your prayer and I have seen your tears. So, oddly enough, the same phrase we find when Hagar is run out of the camp with Abraham and Sarah, and her and Ishmael are out in the desert, and the angel comes to her and he says, God has seen you. He's seen your tears. So it's crazy how the same line is used again, but it is. And so it's an acknowledgement that God is not overlooking your current situation, and he understands it, and he appreciates it, and he wants to do something about it. Look, I will heal you. On the third day from now, you will go up to the Lord's temple. I will add 15 years to your life. I will rescue you and this city from the grasp of the king of Assyria. I will defend the city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. So, some of what's happening here, all of these stories, the timeline is not perfect between the two accounts. But what we're finding here is that some of this illness is brought on by pride. And God is saying, because of your, we talked about earlier, humbleness, I'm going to add 15 years to your life. But understand, I'm not doing this only for you. I'm doing this for me and for the sake of your ancestor David. You've got to understand that your place in this is much lower than my place in it, and even David's place in it. Because why is that? God made a covenant with David saying that your descendant is going to stay on the throne forever. So David is elevated not because of how great David was, but because God made a covenant with him. And that's going to be true. Ultimately, it happens through Jesus. That's why the genealogies in Luke and Matthew are important. It's important to help us understand that what God said he would do, he's done. And he's done it even in ways we would have never thought to happen. With prostitutes as part of the story and everything else. See? He's not, he doesn't condemn anybody in his own genealogy. He makes every person useful that wants to be useful, regardless of what their situation may be at the time or what it may have been in the past. So this is what happens. So he's healed, and the thing about going up to the temple is you're going to go worship me in 3 days, and everything's going to be okay. So then Isaiah said, and this is probably the miraculous sign that everybody's talking about. Hezekiah had asked, well, let me go back to 7. Then Isaiah said, bring a lump of pressed figs. So they brought it and applied it to the infected skin, and he recovered. Hezekiah asked Isaiah, what is the sign that the Lord will heal me? Then I will go up to the Lord's temple on the 3rd day. And the thing is, well, your shadow's going to move backwards while you're moving down the stairs. Okay, so your shadow's not going to fall like it should. It's going to go backwards. This is the sign to you from the Lord, that he will do what he has promised. Should the shadow go ahead 10 steps or go back 10 steps? Hezekiah answered, it is easy for the shadow to lengthen 10 steps. No, let the shadow go back 10 steps. So that's what happened. And that's what most people think is the miraculous sign. Did people travel all the way from Babylon just to hear about that? Probably not. It's probably all a ruse to create this new alliance against the Babylonians, and maybe even to find out, what kind of treasure he had. All right, let's go back to 2 Chronicles, and we're going to look at Manasseh really quick. Because this is kind of a Manasseh's another example, like Ahab, that you can be the worst of the worst, and God still is not going to turn his back on you if your heart's contrite and humble. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. He probably his kingship at 12 probably overlapped the final years of his dad's by 10 or 12 years. So when he was king by himself, he was probably in his early 20s, like most of the kings were. He reigned 55 years, long time. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, imitating the detestable practices of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites. So he's doing what the Canaanites did before Joshua and them ever entered. So we've seen this rerun before, where we're brought all the way back to the beginning. It's just like nothing ever happened. It's like they've entered the promised land, and instead of God conquering all their enemies, they just started living with them and behaving just like them. Verse 3, he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had torn down, reestablished the altars for the Baals, so they've gone back to Baal worship. He made the Asherah poles, and he bowed and worshiped to all the stars in the sky and served them. So this is a popular, astrology was big time in the East, but especially with the Babylonians. They were into astral worship. And so you begin to see that there's becoming an increased influence from Babylon already, and there hasn't even been an overthrow. He built altars in the Lord's temple where the Lord had said, Jerusalem is where my name will remain forever. So that's from Solomon's dedication of the temple. He built altars to all the stars in the sky in both courtyards of the Lord's temple, the outer court and the inner court. The inner court is where all the sacrifices were. He passed his sons through the fire in Ben-Hinnom Valley, which later becomes the Gehenna Valley, which we know in the New Testament is where the forever trash dump. It's just always on fire. It's just a trash dump for Jerusalem, and there's a fire burning all the time. And Jesus uses it as an illustration of that's what it's like to be outside the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying here that he burned his sons in sacrifice in this place. He practiced witchcraft, divination, and sorcery, and consulted with mediums and spiritualists. He did a huge amount of evil in the Lord's sight, angering him. So this list that they give right there is a list that God says you don't do back when he's giving them the law and telling them how to live. Back in, I think it's in Leviticus, this list finds itself. So the writer's saying that everything that God said don't do, Manasseh's doing. And it's all an affront to God, and it's really making him angry. So Manasseh set up a carved image of the idol which he had made in God's temple that God had spoken about to David and his son Solomon. I will establish my name forever in this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. I will never again remove the feet of the Israelites from the land where I stationed your ancestors. If only they will be careful to do all I have commanded them through Moses, all the laws, statutes, and judgments. So Manasseh caused Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to stray so that they did worse evil in the nations of the Lord than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. So what are they saying here? The writer's saying that God made a promise to David and to Solomon. As long as the people obey my laws, statutes, and ordinances, then they're never going to leave this land. So this is the big foreshadowing moment here. He said, but they're not doing that. They're doing everything. They're the opposite of everything I've told them to do. And so, quite naturally, if God made a promise, if you do what I say, I'm going to let you stay in the land. If you don't do what I'm saying, you're going to have to leave. Because ultimately, it's whose land? It's God's land. He can do with it what he wants. And he's making that clear to them. So this is what happens. Verse 10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they didn't listen. So God doesn't turn his back. In fact, he's seeking Manasseh out. So here we find something that's beginning to get turned on its head. All right? We see this before in Ahab, but Ahab doesn't seek God out. Jehoshaphat does it, and God is able to say, yeah, I will do what you want me to do so that Ahab can see that I'm the Lord God. Okay? And so he not once but twice defeats an army for Ahab so that he can see that he's the Lord God. Okay, so it's kind of a neutral way. So Asa says, if you seek the Lord, he will allow himself to be found. Ahab doesn't seek, but Jehoshaphat does. But it's for the benefit of Ahab. Okay, so that Ahab can see. So he's not seeking, but he can see. Well, here we find that God is actually seeking out Manasseh. So God starts in one place, but he turns it upside down and says, okay, I'll do the seeking. All right? But he says nobody's listening. But the idea of God seeking us out leads us right into Jesus coming. I mean, it's the ultimate of God seeking us out. So this place of sinfulness, this place of terrible rebellion and just doing the complete opposite of what God intended, God doesn't just burn with anger and say, okay, no more for you. He comes to them and he speaks to them, but they still don't listen. So he brought against them the military commanders of Assyria. So God's not bashful in what he's doing here. If I've got to send an army to get you to listen to me, I'm going to send an army to get you to listen to me. Okay? So I'm going to send to you the worst thing that you can imagine in all of this so that you'll listen to me. And then we wonder why we have trouble sometime in our life. And it's because we haven't been listening. If God's willing to do this then, why would he not be willing to do it now? What changed with Jesus in the middle of that when Jesus says, look, the way's narrow. This is a narrow way you're on with me. If you veer to the right or the left, there's going to be trouble. And I'm there, but I can't pull you out. You've got to be repentant and ask for forgiveness, and so on and so forth. This is what he does. Okay, so they captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him up with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. So this is the picture. You know the hooks. You know what these hooks are? Put them right there. Oh God, I can't even imagine that. So they run these hooks. Big old fish hooks through his pectors. And they're leading him like that. Imagine how painful that was. And he's in shackles. And he walks all the way to Babylon. That's a long ways. So this is a long time to think about God, don't you think? Ma'am?
Is he the one that took his eyeballs out?
Oh, no, not this one. So they led him off to Babylon. When he was in distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God and earnestly humbled himself before the God of his ancestors. So here we have both concepts. He's seeking God and he's humbled himself. All right? The two great ingredients of having the relationship with God, to humble and to seek him out. So that's what he does. He prayed to him, and the Lord was receptive to his prayer. He granted his request and brought him back to Jerusalem to his kingdom. All right, so Manasseh came to know that the Lord is God. The very thing that God was trying to get Ahab to know, Ahab never knew. Ahab just kept going back and make political alliances to benefit him, and he never let those things work in his favor to know God. Manasseh actually says that he came to know the Lord as his God. So this is why God can respond to a pagan's request. All right, because at this point, Manasseh is a pagan worshiper. He's worshiping these gods. But this is why God can respond to him when he prays. Because God knows there's no other God but him. Okay? There's nothing still that stands in between the Manasseh and God. There's no gods that stand in between. What stood in between Manasseh and God? Pride and arrogance. He wasn't seeking God and he was prideful. The reason why he couldn't seek God is because he was prideful. So when he finally humbles himself and seeks God, God's there because there's nothing really else that stands in between us. Those two things. There's really no other gods. We worship other things, but when we come to that point of humility before God and seeking him out, none of those things matter to him. And so we find that they really shouldn't matter to us if that's the relationship we really want. The question always becomes, what do we really want? That was the question in the Garden of Eden. What do you really want? That's kind of the deception that the serpent provides Eve, and she's not sure what she wants. She knows that she can have what's desirable to her eyes that might give me some wisdom, but she's lost sight of the relationship with God completely. And so we do the same. The same thing is illustrated here. It becomes illustrative all the way through Scripture until we get to Jesus and he makes it clear that if you want this relationship that I have with the Father, you have to take up your cross daily and follow me. And his whole ministry is about that. So Manasseh came to know that the Lord came to know that the Lord is God. After this, he builds the outer wall of the city of David from west of Gihon in the valley to the entrance of the fish gate. He brought it around the Ophel, and he heightened it considerably. He also placed military commanders in all the fortified cities of Jerusalem. So he's saying, I'm not going to let happen to me what happened to me again. It's not going to happen. So Some estimates say that by the time he got through with these refortification of the walls, they were 20 feet thick. That's thick. This room's 14 feet. If I remember right, 12 or 14 feet. So imagine how thick that is. And he says he made them considerably higher. So we don't really know how much higher. But he knows that he's not through, and that the nation's not through with these invading kings. But then he goes on to say, he removed the foreign gods and the idol from the Lord's temple, whatever that idol was, but they call it the idol twice now, along with all the altars that he had built on the mountain of the Lord's temple and in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside the city, probably in the valley, Ben Hinnom, where they burned everything. He built the altar of the Lord and offered fellowship and thank offerings on it. Then he told Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. However, and there's that word that always is a problem for them, the people still sacrificed at the high places, but only to the Lord their God. All right, so what's the problem, God? Why can't we worship where it's convenient to worship if we're worshiping you? All right. So what was the problem with that? Okay.
They didn't use the proper way, to the Levites in the temple.
The proper way and the community way. Okay. So the relationship that God had with his people was not singular in any sense of the word. Okay? The worshipers brought their sacrifices singularly or for their family. But it was to be enjoyed by an extension of the nation in some sort of way. Okay? Either with the priest, the Levite, the poor. In some way there was an extension of what was going on beyond just you and enjoyed by others. So his desire, as it's always been, is to have his people unified and together. And if they were worshiping just anywhere, then it was not going to happen that way. There was a unifying force in shared worship that God not only intended for them, but designed in their life together. And I think I touched on this in one of my classes. I was talking about it. But there's a reason why it's important for the church to meet together as often as it can. And it is because there's something designed in it where we become stronger, and the church and the mission of the church becomes fuller and stronger. And I think that's been illustrated since the very beginning. The other thing that it does is that it requires a little more. When I looked at this in my post-COVID world, I thought about people sitting at home and watching worship on TV rather than making the effort to be a part of it. Because I can just go worship God under the tree in my house. I can take my phone and go sit out, and I can watch. I can be a part of everything right there. But it's not exactly the same, but it's some of the same. Because God's intention is I want to experience my family together. And that's why fellowship membership is important. You shouldn't say, I'm going to go to that church because I can make some good business connections there. I know a guy in Baton Rouge to this day. He goes to Bible study at one church and worship at another church. And he does it because he's an attorney and he has business connections in both places. Okay. Now, he might be fine with that. I'm not saying that that's wrong. He might have great fellowship with both. But there's also that possibility that he's not a part of those fellowships for the reasons that God intended for him to be a part. And so he's probably not, even if he's a great giver, he might be a great tither because I know he's got money. That still may not be enough of what God wants from him, but he's divided, so he can't, really give himself to one or the other. And it's like that in any church. You should be a part of that church because that's where God is going to manifest himself to you and make you a part of that particular family that is before him. I think that's important. But obviously not everybody thinks that way. Or else all our churches would be full every week. So that was the downfall. He introduced these things, and he did his best to do away with them at the end of his life, but the damage had been done again. And so his son, who turns out to be as bad as him, kind of builds on that same mistake, purposefully dishonoring God. So here, 18, we're going to quit at verse 20. The rest of the events of Manasseh's reign, along with his prayer to his God and the words of the seers who spoke to him in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, are written in the events of Israel's kings. So the prayer we looked at the last time, we may go back and look at it again. But the prayer was so significant that it's mentioned in this postlude to his life, where it's talking about his death. So that's a pretty important thing. It's important to go back and look at that prayer if they're naming it again and listing it. His prayer and how God was receptive to his prayer, and all his sin and unfaithfulness, and the sites where he built high places and set up Asherah poles and carved images before he humbled himself. They are all written in the events of Hosea. So what it's saying is, Hosea kept a record of all his sins, of all his unfaithfulness, and the location of all these idols that he had built. Okay, so there's a record of his goodness and his repentedness and his humility, and there's also a record of everything that he did, bad. It's the only one that's listed like that in the whole Bible, and all these kings. So it says, Manasseh rested with his fathers, and he was buried in his own house. His son Amon became king in his place. So for the writer, the chronicler, he didn't earn a place of rest among the kings. Okay, he was buried in his own house. He didn't even have a place where the public would be able to come and honor Hezekiah. So he came in with banging gangbusters against God. He humbles himself, and God spares him. And in the end, his burial pretty much reflects the way he ended his life of deep humility. So when you look at the list of kings, they'll say, oh, this one was bad or this one was good. It starts out bad, but then it has a little slash and it'll say it was good. So when you look at the whole story, there really is a lot of hope, that godly hope that's wrapped up in the story, where you can intentionally set out to be the worst king that you can be in the history of the country. I'm going to worship the idols. I'm going to burn my children. I'm going to worship the stars. I'm going to do everything Moses said not to do. It's like he went down a checklist and said, that's what Moses said don't do. That's what I'm doing. Okay, so he's that kind of guy. And we've all met people like that. They're just the whole life is a custom job against God. They're just going to do it their way against God. And that's the way his life was. And then he goes through this traumatic experience where he's carried into captivity. Where before, Manasseh could do whatever he wanted to do. He was king, and he kind of had the support of the people. They kind of liked all this idol worship by now. I mean, they've been doing it for centuries. And he gets carried into exile, and he begins to wonder about it. So he goes through this great life-changing pain and separation and suffering. And we've looked at this 100 times. It's in those places where people finally say, man, I really need to have a different type of attitude and outlook to who God is. And I think the only way it's going to work for me is to humble myself for him, which is exactly what God illustrates over and over again. And he does, and he actually vocalizes that to God, and God hears his prayer and says, okay, I'm going to set you free from all this that you've got yourself into, and you can go back and let that humility work for you. And he does. He starts tearing down all the idols, and he realizes that he's got to get ready for more of what he's been through, because this isn't the end. God gives him time to do that. that episode of getting the cities ready and the walls ready, that's like a 20-year period. And you can look on a map and see how small all this really is. It's not even a month's march from the farthest reaches of Babylon to this place. So they could have shown up at any time, but for 20 years, God's holding all this off. And that whole time, Manasseh's humility is working for him, working for the people. And ultimately, when he dies with a great sense of humility before God. It's just that his kid didn't learn it very well at all. He's as bad as his daddy. So, all right, well, that's that, because I've got to go take kids home.